The truth struck like lightning through propaganda's lies. History buried the real hero beneath glossy magazine covers and movie posters. While photographers captured the Spitfire's elegant curves, another fighter carried Britain's survival on its fabric wings. That fighter was dismissed as primitive, too simple, too ordinary to matter. Yet when the final tallies were counted, this forgotten warrior had destroyed more German aircraft than any other. The Hurricane, the workhorse that saved an empire. Above London's burning streets, explosions lit the darkness. German bombers had found their target again. The royal residence erupted in flames and debris. Civilians pressed against shop windows, watching their world collapse. Air raid sirens wailed through smoke-filled air. High overhead, engines screamed in deadly pursuit. Flight Sergeant James Ginger Lacy wrestled with his Hurricane's controls. His knuckles were white against the stick. Sweat ran down his face despite the cold altitude. The German formation was already turning away. Their bombs had fallen. Their mission was complete. But Lacy refused to let them escape unpunished. His aircraft was no beauty queen. The newspapers never featured its ungainly profile. Its wings were covered in fabric like aircraft from the previous war. Its fuselage looked boxy and crude compared to the graceful Spitfire. But appearances deceived. The Merlin engine beneath the cowling produced over 1,000 horsepower. 8 machine guns waited in the wings, ready to spit death. Lacy closed the distance. His thumb found the firing button. Streams of tracers reached across the sky. The German bomber shuddered as bullets tore through aluminum skin. Flames erupted from the engine nacelles. The Heinkel rolled over and began its final dive toward the Thames. Enemy fighters turned to engage. A Messerschmitt dove from above, cannons blazing. Lacy's Hurricane bucked as shells exploded against its frame. Oil sprayed across his windscreen. Metal fragments peppered the cockpit. Still the sturdy fighter held together. Still it answered the controls. This was the Hurricane's gift. Not speed, not elegance, but the ability to absorb punishment and keep fighting. As the German formation scattered, one question burned through the smoke and chaos. How had this unglamorous machine become Britain's unexpected salvation? Europe balanced on the edge of catastrophe in those final years before the war. Beneath the surface, calm, dangerous currents were stirring. Across the English Channel, Adolf Hitler's regime worked in shadowy secrecy. The Luftwaffe was being reborn. Modern fighters and bombers rolled from German factories in violation of every peace treaty. Meanwhile, Britain clung to outdated biplanes that belonged in museums rather than combat squadrons. The Royal Air Force seemed frozen in the past. Commanders debated whether monoplanes could really replace proven biplane designs. Would new engines prove reliable under the stress of combat? Hesitation and doubt plagued every decision. Germany prepared for blitzkrieg warfare, lightning-fast strikes using coordinated air and ground forces. Bomber streams protected by modern fighters would shatter enemy resistance before it could organize. Against such tactics, Britain's fabric-covered biplanes would be slaughtered. The need for modern fighters had become desperate. Inside Hawker Aircraft's drawing offices, designer Sidney Cam saw the approaching storm. While others hesitated, he pushed forward with revolutionary ideas. His vision was radical for its time. A monoplane fighter built around the powerful new Merlin engine. The prototype first flew in November 1935. To many observers, it looked disappointingly ordinary. The Hurricane lacked the sleek lines that photographers loved. Its mixed construction combined modern metal framework with old-fashioned fabric covering. But beneath that modest appearance lay the future of British air defense. Here was a fighter that could be manufactured quickly, repaired easily, and flown by inexperienced pilots without disaster. The stage was set for the coming storm. Europe moved inexorably toward total war. Britain stood vulnerable to invasion, and into that gathering darkness, the hurricane prepared to write its name in history. Practicality over perfection. That philosophy guided every aspect of the hurricane's development. In Britain's aircraft factories, engineers labored under Sidney Cam's watchful eye. They knew survival would depend not on beauty, but on reliability. The design embodied contradictions. Metal framework supported fabric skin, bridging old and new technologies. The heart of the machine was thoroughly modern, a Rolls-Royce Merlin V-12 producing over 1,000 horsepower. Strength defined the hurricane, not elegance. It could absorb battle damage that would destroy lesser aircraft. Bullets could punch through its wings without bringing it down. Pilots could crash land and walk away from impacts that would prove fatal in other fighters. Training pilots discovered this forgiving nature immediately. The hurricane turned responsively, but not violently. It warned pilots before entering dangerous flight attitudes. For the Royal Air Force, about to fill squadrons with teenagers barely out of school, this characteristic was invaluable. Yet the early versions had serious flaws. Wooden two-blade propellers reduced acceleration to dangerous levels. Against swift German fighters, this handicap could prove fatal. Urgent modifications followed. Three-blade constant-speed propellers that transformed climb performance and top speed. Engineers continuously refined the design based on combat experience. Fuel systems were upgraded. Armament was strengthened from the original 8 rifle-caliber machine guns to cannon-armed versions that could shred bombers with explosive shells. Every change reflected lessons learned in blood. Failures in combat led to immediate modifications. Successful innovations spread across squadrons within weeks. The hurricane evolved like a living organism, adapting to survive. While the glamorous Spitfire posed for publicity photographs, the hurricane labored in obscurity. Politicians preferred showcasing the Spitfire's graceful curves as symbols of British technological prowess. The fabric-skinned hurricane looked primitive by comparison. But on muddy French airfields with temporary hangars and inexperienced ground crews, primitive meant practical. Fabric panels could be patched in hours rather than days. Wing sections could be replaced with basic tools. Pilots who crashed could be flying again within a week. As war clouds gathered over Europe, the hurricane had evolved beyond its prototype origins. It had become the backbone of fighter command. Plain, reliable, and ready. Across English grass airfields, hurricanes sat wingtip to wingtip in silent rows. They waited like faithful workhorses, built not for glory, but for endurance. Soon, they would face the ultimate test. Dawn brought frost to northern France on that fateful day in May 1940. Previously peaceful meadows now shook under the thunder of German armored divisions. The Blitzkrieg had begun. From the small grass strip at Bethanyville, Sergeant James "Ginger" Lacy walked toward his waiting hurricane. His boots left prints in the dew-soaked earth. Around him, young pilots adjusted helmet straps and tried to calm their nerves with weak jokes. The hurricane squatted on its landing gear, nose pointing skyward like a hunting dog on the scent. For weeks, the squadron had trained for this moment. Now it had arrived. German bomber formations darkened the eastern horizon. Their shadows crept across the French countryside like approaching death. Radio speakers crackled with urgent commands. "Scramble! All aircraft scramble!" Lacy's pulse hammered as the Merlin engine coughed to life. He pushed the throttle forward, and the Hurricane began its lumbering takeoff roll across the grass. The machine lifted reluctantly into the pale morning sky. Ahead, the battle for Sedan raged in fire and smoke. French defensive lines crumbled under the German assault. The air filled with aircraft silhouettes, Heinkel bombers in tight formations, escorted by deadly Messerschmitt fighters. Distance closed rapidly. Tracer fire began arcing through the sky in bright streams. Lacy pulled his Hurricane into firing position behind a Heinkel bomber. His thumb pressed the gun button. 8 machine guns hammered simultaneously. Bullets tore into the bomber's port wing and engine nacelle. Black smoke poured from the damaged engine. The Heinkel rolled into a death spiral, trailing flames toward the earth below. Victory. But the sky offered no time for celebration. A Messerschmitt Bf-109 flashed across Lacy's nose, cannon shells exploding around the Hurricane's cockpit. He yanked the stick hard right, pulling into the German fighter's blind spot. Short, controlled bursts from his guns found their mark. The Messerschmitt snapped into an inverted dive, smoke streaming from its shattered engine. It plummeted earthward, trailing debris. 2 kills in his first combat mission. When Lacy's Hurricane touched down hours later, mud clinging to its wheels and oil staining his flight suit, his squadron mates could barely believe the report. 3 victories in a single day for a pilot who had never fired his guns in anger. But war showed no mercy to the successful. Days blurred into nights of continuous combat. Squadrons fought, retreated, rearmed, and launched again. Hurricanes clawed through the skies above France, outturning faster opponents, protecting retreating Allied forces as the continent collapsed. The routine became grimly familiar. Wake before dawn to telephone bells, race to aircraft at the first scramble order, fight until ammunition ran dry, crash land or limp home, then fight again. Rest became a luxury few could afford. Reflection was impossible. The Hurricane became simultaneously home, weapon, and potential tomb. When France surrendered in June, the exhausted pilots retreated across the English Channel. Britain now stood completely alone. Hitler's armies gathered on the continental coast, preparing for invasion. On grass airfields across southern England, Hurricanes formed up once more. Their fabric wings bore scars from French skies. Their pilots carried exhaustion like physical weight. But both machine and men remained ready for what was coming. The real battle was about to begin. Terror hung over Britain like storm clouds in the summer of 1940. German invasion barges massed along the French coast, waiting for orders to cross the Channel. Hitler's confidence was absolute. Britain was already defeated. Only the formality of conquest remained. The Luftwaffe's mission was simple: destroy the Royal Air Force and clear the skies for Operation Sea Lion. Every morning brought the same urgent telephone call to squadron dispersals across southeast England. Scramble! Pilots abandoned half-finished breakfasts and raced across dewy grass to their waiting fighters. Engines roared to life. Propellers became spinning discs. Within minutes, the skies over Kent and Sussex thundered with the sound of aerial combat. Hurricanes met the challenge at every turn. They climbed toward formations of Heinkel and Dornier bombers, their gun sights filling with black crosses painted on aluminum wings. Pilots closed to point-blank range before firing. Short, devastating bursts of machine gun fire ripped through thin bomber skins. Engines coughed and died in streams of flame. Bomb loads tumbled uselessly into empty fields instead of vital targets. But victory came at a terrible price. The Messerschmitt Bf-109s came screaming down from altitude, faster and more agile than anything Britain possessed. Hurricanes struggled to match their speed in level flight, but could turn tighter in desperate spirals where survival was measured in inches. For Ginger Lacey, each day merged into the next in a blur of exhaustion and adrenaline. He slept in requisitioned houses with his parachute harness as a pillow. Alarm bells haunted his dreams. The smell of aviation fuel permeated his clothing and hair. September brought the Blitz. London burned under relentless night bombing. On September 13th, a formation of Heinkels streaked toward the capital. Their bombs crashed into Buckingham Palace, sending the royal household diving for shelter. Lacy dove his Hurricane into the formation, ignoring the tracer fire that shattered his starboard wing. Hot oil sprayed across his windscreen. Shrapnel grazed his shoulder. Still, he pressed the attack. The lead bomber erupted in flames and spun toward the Thames. Lacy's Hurricane limped home with its engine misfiring and oil streaming from punctured lines. Somehow, both pilot and machine survived. 2 days later came the ultimate test. September 15th, forever after, known as Battle of Britain Day. The Luftwaffe launched its largest assault yet, nearly 1,000 aircraft darkening the skies. From the grass field at Gravesend, Lacy scrambled once more into the chaos. He locked onto a Dornier bomber and sent it spinning earthward in flames. A Messerschmitt cut across his nose. The Hurricane groaned as he hauled it into a tight turn, but the German fighter couldn't follow. Another kill. Then disaster struck. Cannon shells from an unseen attacker ripped through the Hurricane's fuselage. Flames licked around the cockpit. Lacy tore off his harness and slid back the canopy. At 3,000 feet above the Kent countryside, he hurled himself into space. His parachute opened just above the fields near Maidstone. Below, his Hurricane burned like a funeral pyre on English soil. Hours later, shaken but determined, Lacy was back in the air. Another Hurricane, another mission, another chance to stop the invasion. By nightfall, he had destroyed 4 enemy aircraft in a single day. Across southern England, similar stories multiplied. 60 German aircraft lay in smoking ruins. Hitler's invasion plans crumbled. Operation Sea Lion was quietly abandoned. In official photographs, the elegant Spitfire gleamed as Britain's symbol of defiance. But the statistics told a different story. 2/3 of fighter command flew Hurricanes. 60% of all German losses fell to Hurricane pilots. The plain, fabric-covered workhorse had carried the greater burden. Against all expectations, it had saved Britain from invasion. When the smoke finally cleared over southern England, the true cost became apparent. The Luftwaffe had been decisively beaten, its promise of swift conquest broken against the determination of young pilots flying Hurricanes and Spitfires. Operation Sea Lion, Hitler's invasion plan, was shelved indefinitely. The Führer had failed to bring Britain to its knees, but survival had demanded a terrible price. Fighter command squadrons were decimated. In some mess halls, empty chairs multiplied week by week. Pilots returned from morning sorties to find familiar faces missing, their belongings already cleared away. For every victory celebration, there was private grief. The Hurricane itself paid dearly. Dozens were lost each week, their twisted remains scattered across the English countryside. Crash sites marked the spots where young men had died defending their homeland. Yet the machine had proven something remarkable. It could be manufactured rapidly in dispersed factories. Battle damage could be repaired quickly using basic tools. Most importantly, it could return to combat again and again with grim determination. As the Battle of Britain transitioned into the Blitz, the Hurricane adapted once more. Fitted with primitive radar and heavy cannons, it became a night fighter stalking German bombers, through searchlight beams and darkness. Beyond Britain's shores, the hurricane carried its burden to distant battlefields. Over Malta, it defended the besieged island against relentless Axis air attacks. The survival of this Mediterranean fortress meant life or death for Allied convoys. In the Soviet Union, nearly 3,000 Hurricanes arrived under Lend-Lease agreements. Russian pilots initially scorned these plain-looking fighters from the West. But as winter closed in, they discovered the Hurricane's true worth. It remained reliable in bitter cold that disabled other aircraft. It could be maintained with scarce resources. It was dependable when survival was the only thing that mattered. Everywhere the Hurricane served, it became whatever was needed. Bomber interceptor, ground attack fighter, reconnaissance platform. It was never the star of newsreels, but always the reliable performer. Soldiers on the ground learned to trust its distinctive engine note overhead. Mechanics appreciated its straightforward design. Pilots respected its ability to bring them home even when riddled with bullet holes. In propaganda posters and newspaper headlines, the graceful Spitfire captured public imagination as Britain's defender. But within fighter command, a different truth was understood. The Hurricane had shouldered the heavier load during Britain's darkest hour. By the end of 1940, the world recognized a fundamental shift. The invasion of Britain had been stopped. Hitler would turn his attention eastward to Russia. The war would continue on new fronts. But Britain endured, and its survival owed much to unglamorous fighters flown by men like Ginger Lacy. The Hurricane had bought precious time when time was all that stood between freedom and conquest. The aftermath was not peace, but transformation. The Hurricane had proven itself indispensable, and now it would serve wherever the expanding war demanded its presence. When victory finally came in 1945, the Hurricane had already begun fading from public memory. Its sleeker stablemate, the Spitfire, dominated magazine covers and museum displays as the eternal symbol of British resistance. But those who lived through the desperate summer of 1940 remembered differently. They recalled the machine that had carried the heaviest burden when Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany. James Ginger Lacy returned from war as one of Britain's highest-scoring aces. 28 confirmed victories stretched from the fields of France, through the skies over England, to the jungles of Burma. But when interviewed in later years, he spoke not of personal glory, but of the Hurricane that had brought him through. He credited the sturdy fighter that had absorbed punishment and kept flying when other aircraft would have fallen apart. Time and again, the Hurricane had carried him home with battle damage that should have been fatal. After the war, Lacy became a flying instructor, passing hard-won knowledge to new generations. Decades later, he advised filmmakers creating Battle of Britain, ensuring that every detail of the aerial sequences rang true to his experience. His testimony preserved the memory of what combat had really been like in the cockpit of an often overlooked fighter. Without his voice, the Hurricane's contribution might have been forgotten entirely. Military historians eventually compiled the definitive statistics. During the Battle of Britain, Hurricanes destroyed significantly more German aircraft than their famous Spitfire cousins. They accounted for roughly 60% of all Luftwaffe losses, most of them the bombers that would otherwise have reduced British cities to rubble. It was the Hurricane, patched with fabric, plain in appearance, unglamorous in reputation, that had truly turned back the tide of invasion. The numbers don't lie, even when popular memory prefers more romantic versions of history. The Hurricane's legacy transcends statistics and battle reports. It represents the victory of substance over style, reliability over glamour. In Britain's darkest hour, survival depended not on the most beautiful fighter, but on the most dependable one. This lesson resonates beyond military aviation. Nations are preserved not only by heroic symbols, but by the quiet strength of those who bear responsibility without seeking recognition. The hurricane, overlooked yet essential, proved that endurance matters more than elegance. Perhaps that is the deepest truth revealed by this forgotten fighter's story. In moments of supreme crisis, survival belongs to those willing to do whatever is necessary, however unglamorous the task might be. Britain survived because young men flew plane fighters that never appeared on recruitment posters. They fought in aircraft that historians would later neglect, but they held the line when holding the line meant everything. The Hurricane deserves recognition as the most unexpected hero of World War II, not for its beauty, but for its service. Not for its fame, but for its faithfulness. In the end, that proved to be enough to save a nation and change the course of history.